Hi, and welcome back to Plan 9 Crunch. I am Joe Gibson, and recently I adapted my blog post reviewing the whole of Ultraman Omega to this YouTube page. You can follow the links to find the two parts of that. I probably should explain what this video is before I thrust you into it. While I am putting up weird videos here, I am also in college trying to earn my bachelor's degree with an English major, so I have had even weirder classes, often pertaining to the various literary critical theories. There are many reasons for someone such as myself to use these theories I've learned in class. One, to supplement my education by grounding these theories in something I enjoy. Two, to further the discourse on the topics we cover here with tried and true methods for media analysis. And finally, three, when I originally started to review Ultraman Omega, I messed up counting the episodes and reviewed the first recap episode as episode 9, and then needed to justify a solo review for the actual episode 9 in some way. I'll let you all decide which one of those is the most accurate to why this essay exists. But as you can tell from the title, the thumbnail, this turned into a Marxist analysis of Ultraman Omega. So let's briefly go over how we got there. One of my favorite types of essays to write for Plan 9 Crunch is the wacky premise follow-through. Though, who is the better savior of humanity? Jesus Christ or Gamera is an objectively absurd question. There is a conversation to be had there at least once, and you can find that on the channel pretty easily. Viewing an episode of Children's Monster of the Week television through a Marxist lens is silly enough to get a click, but also still a fruitful challenge for me, a 20-something undergraduate with only a passing knowledge and some textbooks elaboration on Marxism, to do properly. So this also requires active research from me, which I think makes this premise slightly funnier. Alright, Marxism, while a political ideology, is also a strain of literary criticism, and like structuralism or new criticism, is a tool to understand stories both in terms of their content and the consumer culture they exist in, and further, through their marketability. Tools, whether for literature or for labor, exist for me to use when necessary, and just because I use a hammer to strike a nail does not mean I'm about to pick up a sickle. I've had this part of the script written for months. I probably should have brought a hammer and a sickle for this point. Anyway, I find each version of literary criticism silly and exclusionary in its own way, but I have attempted to use Jungian structuralism to understand Gamera films, radical ecofeminism to understand Nosferatu 2024, some permutation of new criticism for Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, and close reads for many of my other reviews because they work contextually. So why not try this? Alright, let's begin the analysis. Ultraman Omega Episode 9 is titled the Kananari Kaiju Park because essentially the CEO of the Kananari Corporation wishes to build a theme park around a sleeping kaiju to rake in the profits. This episode contrasts the views of our leads. Sorato Okita, Kosei Hoshimi, Ayumu Ichido, and the CEO surrounding this kaiju, and even serves as Sorato's introduction to the concept of money. As this shows Ultraman Omega, he's not only an extraterrestrial, but an amnesiac one. So at this point in the show, neither he nor I knew if his original society functioned on a monetary system. Since then, we have learned that his society was based on mere observation and reifying the status quo. So Omega is explicitly a revolutionary character by rejecting that tradition to help a downtrodden class, but we'll get more to that later. Right now, we're on episode 9. This episode also exists in the context of tokusatsu entertainment, where via costumes, practical effects, and some computer-generated imagery, performers act as both the kaiju and the heroes in battles to entertain and sell toys every week. Both the content and the real-world existence of the show will be necessary for this analysis. So after a cold open discovering the monster Gubila and then the theme song, the episode really opens with how Kosei is broke before payday, and thus he and Sorato, who both have advanced hunger needs from their work as the Medio Kaiju and Ultraman respectively, they have to fight over a banana with rock, paper, scissors. In an earlier episode, we met Kosei's boss, a seemingly very benevolent, fatherly boss, that was letting Kosei live in the warehouse while he figures out if he wants to keep the job, and even gives an extension on that offer. He is absent here, but implicit to the episodic conflict as the employer. Sorry, let me rephrase that. A compassionate person characterized as the ideal boss still cannot administer a fair wage to meet his employees' needs, causing infighting between the poor and hungry labor force that keeps Japan getting destroyed every single week. This seems like either an accidental or intentional criticism of capitalism, and this episode goes on to interrogate the characters' views on money through the materialist concept of understanding life and money through food. You may be thinking that this commentary is in vain because the hunger of Kosei and Sorato is a comedic cartoon side effect of the heroics and not just class commentary. If the joke functions consistently as is, why read anything else into it? Well, for one thing, it keeps coming up in the series, and is clearly important in the beginning, middle, and end of this episode, but also Marxist literary criticism has a multi-pronged approach, let's say, to the anthropological use of literature, the expression of political revolution, and struggles in literature, and how the form of literature codifies the ideology. Basically, that means that for this exercise, I have to analyze not only blatant class commentary, but the passive literary devices of form, including subtext, and also the interaction of the art itself with labor. And let's do that last one first, so it's out of the way for the rest of this. So, Anthropological Criticism of the Ultra series. Interrogating the anthropological criticism of the episode, and the series as a whole, this type of art exists to entertain, and it employs a lot of labor to do so. Suit acting is a very grueling line of work and dangerous, with pyrotechnics involved in the battle scenes, on top of the risks of pro wrestling in sweat lakes that the suits themselves generate from their heat and their dense materials, oftentimes. Special effects artists in Japan are also very notoriously underpaid and overworked. That is one of the major reasons a film like Godzilla Minus One can cost less than $10 million to make. Ultraman exists in a very special zone of this, though, where the toy company Bandai has a stake in Tsuburaya Productions, and toy commodity commercials air within the YouTube uploads as part of the 30-minute video. Not only does this production model hide the faces and withhold capital from the workers, the toy sales will then further alienate the consumers from the quite dramatic labor cost of producing those scenes. When the children at home recreate the fight scenes, they will be alienated from the means of production of those fight scenes, even that they will not have to create the suits and buildings or physically act as them and suffer the cost of fighting or animating. This is almost more dramatic than the classic example of the factory worker only making a component piece and never seeing the whole, or the example of alienation where we do not make our own clothes from scratch anymore. Furthermore, the delusion of consumer choice, with the vast amount of Ultraman toys, reissues, repaints, and even card games, would, from a Marxist perspective, trick the proletariat into accepting the status quo through the illusion that whichever toys they buy are an expression of their individuality or status. Worse still are the scalpers that find a way to turn the toys into capital through reselling at higher prices. Since I wrote that segment, it has come out that Tsuburaya Productions, or more precisely its shareholder companies Bandai and the gambling company Fields, have partnered with generative AI platforms. I do not know what will come of this outside of the increasing amounts of fan-made AI fight scenes, but if the AI ever starts to replace these faceless, nameless workers, that would be the most extreme example of alienation from labor, which ironically enough makes it the logical endpoint of capitalism and a necessary prerequisite for many models of communism. Even though we're not there yet, we are at a pretty dramatic stage of this already and may need to fear for what the future brings on that front. All that said, some shows still do make an effort to be less toyetic and give actual meaning to the character of the Ultra, the personalities of the monsters, or the efficacy of the weapons. Whether or not that improves anything for a Marxist is unclear to me at this time, but it does represent a contradiction in how the show is being made and what it's trying to do. Reikiness, the first Medio Kaiju in armor in the show, is one of the most expressive characters and is the power that working class Kosei gets to change the world. Yet usually appears in a miniature CG form that resembles the transforming toy you can buy on the market right now. Technically speaking, there is an inherent contradiction here, but that's sort of expected within Marxism. In Marxism, the concept of dialectics refers to how contradictions, be them the way workers like Kosei are fooled into valuing capital over their own labor, when what he really needs is enough food, or more philosophical arguments, develop themselves and also negate in order to create new concepts. I cannot wrap my head around fully these dialectics because Marx did not invent them as a philosophical concept. I think he took them from Hegel, and while dealing with the pre-existing baggage of that term, he still did not define it better than previous thinkers. Further research also indicates that Engels, Marx's friend, defined it 4 different times in ways that differ from Hegel's 2 pre-existing definitions. If you will permit me, I will summarize Vladimir Lenin's 1914 summary of dialectics. There's like a unity of opposites and the contradictory relations of a thing with itself and the rest of the superstructure, and the struggle of opposites allows for the discovery of new facets. In context, I think it works to say that the toyetic commodification of tokusatsu labor leads to both increasing exploitation and increasing effort to make the commodities more genuine, which further allows story and character-driven commodities like rakiness to make even more money and thus exploit the workers even more, while also having the inverse effect where more shameless commodities can result in more story-driven efforts for a variety of reasons. I hope that makes sense. This is still very difficult to parse, even with Lenin trying to dumb it down for us. They're surprisingly difficult to explain, but they do seem to fit here as a Marxist mechanism for analyzing the contradiction inherent to toyetic characters yo-yoing between mere capital and storytelling. Any deeper into that topic already gets us into the ideological criticism of story's form and structure, exemplified through defeatist Western Marxist writings following the fall of the Soviet Union. So let us discuss that, and then we'll actually get to how this episode conveys themes of revolution once we're done with that. Alright. One of the main emerging criticisms of Ultraman Omega is how it seems to be very cheaply made with reused suits, an Omega costume that broke in episode 2, and many battles in a random forest environment. We can take or leave that last point because the back half of the show features a lot more varied scenarios, but the point about the reused monsters went on to define this show. The Ultra series has long been defined by mixing and matching pieces of its monster characters into new ones to fill other episode roles intended for other monsters. Gubila is this week's Monster of the Week, and Gubila, the drill-nosed whale, has the honor of reappearing so weirdly often that people speculate he might be Tsuburaya Productions' favorite kaiju. Gubila keeps appearing and recently came back as Oka Gubila in like Ultraman Trigger or something. A new form with, I think, slight modifications to enhance its look and threat level. However, this is the Oka Gubila suit, referred to as only Gubila, with no acknowledgement that it's not the original Gubila. The contradiction of reusing suits in different contexts, as both new and old or same and different, is a constant throughout the show and could play into the dialectics we talked about earlier. But one of my sources for this essay also brought up the idea that Marxist cultural critique includes not only how the art is politically expedient, but in the ideology of the audience as well. Whether or not Tsuburaya Productions thinks the audience is bored of Gubila is unclear. Why give him a new form in this latest episode if base Gubila were resonating, and conversely, why take that form away if it rehabilitated the character? The top comments on the YouTube upload are all positive, some even specifically praising Gubila, but the vocal fans disdainful of Gubila would be more important to the planning stage of the episode. It would change the rhetorical situation of the episode. If the average audience member's viewpoint falls on the spectrum from Gubila is such a drawback, I have to think about why they'd possibly include him, to Gubila enhances the text, so I will focus less on metatext. For my own part, I most recently watched Gubila as a sympathetic kaiju in Ultraman Orb, so I did not expect the darker twist here until it happened. It should suffice for now to say that Gubila is also one of their most commercialized kaiju, getting a new toy for every one of his new generation appearances. So any author intending to make criticism of toyetic capitalism would choose Gubila for the story. And any fan sick and tired of Gubila would zero in on that possible subtext as well. As far as the form of the episode, it's pretty straightforward, nothing is told out of order, and the arcs of Kosei, Ayumu, and Kanenari play out subtly with split focus, with the guiding through line of Sorato understanding capitalism through the different outlooks. There are some contrivances, though, and those should be helpful in analyzing the form of the episode. Kosei very abruptly almost craps his pants when he's about to eat the same luxury food he dreams about, having to leave the room. Now, nothing sets this up, and given that the only food we know him to possess at this time is bananas, nature's antacid, there's no reason this should be happening in the first place. Instantaneously, he happens upon a flyer revealing the kaiju park, and gets back to the group just in time to contradict Kanenari's lies that he only intends to keep the kaiju safe from the government, with the proof in his hand. Kanenari, while Kosei was gone, was trying to convince Ayumu to work for him to care for the kaiju, so the contrived discovery of the poster also reveals the broken premise of his plan, that Kanenari wanted to lie to Ayumu about what her job was going to be, while publicly marketing it. Here's the thing though, taking these plot holes as intentional Marxist shortcuts, they actually make sense on their own, and as advancing themes in the episode. Kanenari wants to market the kaiju park to an audience in the thrall of a commodity fetish, the same way he wants to capture our trio with luxury food. That target segment of the population probably describes Nariaki from the recap episodes best of all, but mainly fits Kosei within the earlier setup. So, in a moment of capitalism failing, his marketing was too successful and too targeted for his own good. It instantly found its audience. Also consider that the framing device for every episode trailer. The sensational newscasters. They interpolate the populace to value the kaiju, and Kosei himself literally collects the media kaiju that you, the viewer, yes, you, should pay good money to see fight in the stage shows. Kananari, Tsuburaya Productions, and Kosei as the viewer trying to unravel this exploitation. But also, Kananari's desire to end for Ayumu is literally Marxist alienation. He wanted to employ her labor on the veterinarian component of running a zoo without her ever seeing the larger whole of the product. An incomprehensible, contradictory scenario that only makes sense under dialectical materialism. Also, Sorato as the actual POV character has to be the one that stays behind so we can get exposition from Ayumu about CEOs and wealth, while also witnessing the alluring and disgusting parts of how Kananari conducts himself. In ideological criticism, as I understand it, the central conceit is that art is indirectly political, through redefining the status quo, but also being able to criticize it through satire that interplays between the art, artist, and audience, but is not actionable for revolution. This kind of metatextual critique seems to fit that idea, but again, I am not a Marxist and have to carry out new research to me for this. Please leave your thoughts in the comments of how well I'm presenting this. When I got to this point originally in the essay that you can see on the blog, I name-dropped dialogism and posed a question of if Sorato relearning his heroes implies better, or if Ultraman Gee's inspiration for his heroics coming from superhero media and merchandise fits better than the concept. I received no answer, and that's probably because it was a stupid question. Mikhail Bakhtin is not necessarily a Marxist anyway, so I'm going to table dialogism for another day. I hope you'll forgive me. Alright, now, Sorato as a socialist revolutionary, what you're all waiting for. When it comes to Marxist literary criticism, what you probably expected going into this was, how can I make this a story about heroic worker characters rising up against the constraints of capitalism? And that is an important part of Marxist political literary criticism we will discuss in a moment. Still, it technically would not be essential to this type of analysis, as portraying capitalism failing without the presence of revolutionary characters can still be a Marxist appeal. That is just a truism of all the critical theories. A work that deliberately fails the Bechdel test to prove a point about the patriarchy is still feminist. The original King Kong functions as a valid critique of colonialism and the slave trade, all while using the popular 30s trope of conflating lustful gorillas with black men. Especially for a Marxist, storytelling is an innovative type of thought, and is one of the greatest tragedies how rigid it became. It's either supporting or contradicting consumerism outright. Okay, in the original version of this essay, I left the sentence as is for the purposes of a segue, and I fully forgot about the strict observance of socialist realism in the Stalinist and Maoist strains of 20th century communism when I made that statement. Yeah, that was silly of me in my defense, though, and that's why I'm leaving it in here for this version. My scope for Marxist analysis here covers at least 3 waves of thought: when the early adopters were figuring out their ideology, when communism seemed inevitable throughout the world, and finally the pessimism from after Soviet communism fell. Nothing in Marxism is so simple that you can reduce it to one archetype or one method. However, in this case, at least on an individual scale, this is the type of story with an actionable Marxist revolution. Focusing on the arc of Kosei and Sorato, that opening image is one of comedic desperation, rather than a system from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, involving Sorato, Kosei, his boss, and even Ariaki, their friend next door. Kosei genuinely believes that he has to fight out who gets the rationed banana between him and Sorato. Kosei attributes this newfound poorness as Sorato's fault, but since episode 3, they both have had advanced metabolisms. Kosei thinks about what he would do if he were rich, naming off luxury foods like steak and sushi and fried shrimp as breakfast, lunch, and dinner respectively, because the thought started with hunger, finally settling on a new fishing rod and traveling the world. Living in a society valuing capital above labor has interpolated Kosei with a false consciousness that values money and status. Specifically, Kosei has a commodity fetish because his desire for food translates into luxury food, and his fantasy progresses to more items wanting more and more commodities. Kosei fantasized about those food items because of their exchange value, not their caloric suitability to his needs, use value. Kosei is not the root of the issue, so the episode introduces us to Kananari, the CEO of one of the largest companies in Japan and a very rich man, single-minded in his devotion to money and pursuit of commodities. The marketable experience of stumbling upon the sleeping gorilla will become capital. He brings forth those same commodity foods to seduce Kosei, Ayumu, and Sorato to his team, and a conveniently timed cell phone call reveals that he sees his employees as products to do their job, which is to help him make more money. The trio convene, wanting to get closer to the kaiju so Sorato can identify it, but guards discover them and bring them before Kananari, where he tries to recruit them in the aforementioned lunch. Sorato follows the leads of Kosei and Ayumu in bowing to Kananari, as well as in his initial understanding of capitalism. Ayumu tells him how much money Kananari makes, but Sorato tries to contextualize that in the amount of bananas that can buy, because his example of purchasing power is the poor worker Kosei, who only has bananas right now. Sorato also witnesses how Kananari can yell at an underling and complain that useless employees are the worst thing in the world, where terrorizing kaiju exists, but then be nice to Ayumu and make a humanitarian case for working for him. In Sorato's shoes, we see how odd it is that such an unpleasant man is at the top of this hierarchy dictating capitalistic choices, but through Ayumu's perspective, we understand this is the way it is. When Kosei and Kananari verbally spar about the ethics of the kaiju park, Sorato shares what he has learned. Amidst Kananari appealing to his operation as fiscally responsible and safe because he has the money to hire experts and to enforce his capitalistic perspective as common sense through the Marxist concept of cultural leadership, Sorato questions the status quo. Sorato asks why Kananari needs money, stating that the money is for exchange, and then asking what he plans to exchange it for. Society is as interpolated, even us viewers, with the idea that having a lot of money makes sense, but acknowledging Marx's materialist realities, money exists to help us get bananas. Ayumu ends up taking a version of Kananari's offer, and it seems she listened to Sorato's words because she chooses not to get paid for the work and only stays there to help Sorato identify the kaiju. Because he's Ultraman, Sorato knows all or at least most of these kaiju from previous excursions. However, because he has amnesia, he has to rely on physical sensations to remember the names and abilities of each monster of the week. A partial view of Gubila's backside is not enough. He has to be in the same area at the same time as the beast, usually smelling them, or looking at them through his space gazerness. Anyway, possibly his anti-theme to alienation from the means of production. That said, the major weakness of this reading is that for this first time, a fully body thermal image rendering is enough for Sorato. To be fair, Gubila has a pretty distinct silhouette, and the audience might question if Sorato could see his body and not realize who he is. After this point, however, Sayuki Uta, that's their mentor that joins in the back half of the show, her K-monitor works very dependently in the same vein, and that's because the Ultra series usually tries to advocate for a world where humans step up to replace Ultraman, usually with technology. That does not inherently make it incompatible with Marxism, especially because of the progressing contradictions of dialectics. With Omega as a guide, human technology gets closer to being effective, but this shows us more features of the kaiju that can circumvent these human-created weapons in the back half of the show. Anyway, Sorato has a drive to understand the world, and since Kananari did not answer him, he tries to research his statements to understand why he needs so much money. The CEO's public statements amount to equating money with happiness, but Sorato can tell that Kananari does not seem happy. How he lashed out at the employee over the phone. Later on, when Sorato reflects on the whole adventure, he notices how Kosei managed to be happy even despite a lack of money, which we'll return to after the kaiju fight. One of the most interesting aspects of this conflict is what exactly Kananari thought he was accomplishing with a kaiju park of all things. Gubila is a sleeping kaiju, and he was going to make money off the circumstance wherein people could see, get right up close to a kaiju with no threat to them. The people would continue to go to the park and line his pocket with cash, staying unaware of how they are being exploited, like growing more confident that they're not in danger. Because look at it sleeping there, a slave of the corporation, much weaker than them, the people paying money to see it. Blah. In this scenario, the consumer feels he has more power than the kaiju or the businessman, neither of which is true. Before you tell me this is irrelevant speculation, Gubila actually is counting on this. His scheme this time around is playing dead so as to build a crowd around him of smaller and weaker prey to gorge on. This is far from the sympathetic Gubila I remember or the cute character that the radio show hosts were hoping for. Sorato knows this, but only remembers it in the story after he realizes how transparently backwards Kananari's policies are, which connects these ideas, it codes them together in the literary sense. When Kananari trips in front of a hungry Gubila, he tries to pay off the monster to literally leave him alone. But before this episode can have a character literally eat the rich, Sorato grows into Omega and Kosei helps the CEO up. When Kananari sees Kosei and Ayumu go back to rescue employees so useless they couldn't escape, it inspires him to do the same. This episode allows Kananari to grow as a character, which is interesting. At the same time, he doesn't resolve Kosei's hunger, because Kosei still is hungry at the end and never got to eat the food he offered earlier. But it proves that this newly humanitarian CEO still did not seek out the heroes that did to compensate them. So it's not even really a redemption for him. This could speak to what I brought up earlier about how the audience expectations are important to a story, and a writer of children's television probably thought that tempered optimism was better than radical realism. But on the topic of realism, this puts him in the role of a middle character. We'll get to socialist realism a lot later in the essay, just don't worry about that. I mentioned the phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, and Omega and Medio Kaiju Trigaron genuinely do exemplify this, at least in a way. Kosei and Sorato are doing everything they can there to help save everyone who needs it, and Trigaron only joins the fight to help Omega when it's clear he needs it. Omega only asks Kosei to turn Trigaron into his armor form when his color timer starts blinking, the last moment he can fight, and the first moment where his need fairly supersedes Kosei's. Finally, we return to the warehouse for another game, fighting over the banana, and Sorato comments that Kosei was happy in the game, and at other points, showing that happiness is separate from how much money and capital you have. In realizing he can share the banana and imparting that knowledge to Kosei, Sorato becomes the proletariat abolishing private property, at least within their household. Sorato also was only able to learn and articulate this lesson because of experience in this capitalist society, which is important to this whole thing. Oh, and also, Kosei having the Medio Kaiju at his disposal represents the concept of arming the proletariat for revolution. That's the meme answer to this topic. I feel very strongly about my Marxist analysis of that episode, though with the given corrections and edits. However, there's a difference between a Marxist reading of an episode and a Marxist reading of an entire show or character. So let's discuss some of the later episodes and try some version of the same exercise on them, and as the show on the show as a whole. Consequently, the rest of this analysis is new. And as far as I can tell, still unique, because nobody else is doing this, analyzing Ultraman Omega through a Marxist lens, or God forbid, as a Marxist piece of art. Still, maybe this exercise will prove that the reason for that is that nobody should. The stakes are high, let us proceed. It may seem random to skip all the way to episode 18, as random to start with episode 9 in the first place, but we will also wrap around to the Nariaki Akaji segments later, so I still feel we're covering a necessary amount of the show. In episode 18, Kosei and Sorato go camping to train. Specifically, how well Kosei can fight Sorato with the Medio Kaiju versus Ultraman. And this alien Barasa named Zagon arrives to loot and plunder, taking possession of the Medio Kaiju, and Sorato and Kosei in toy-sized forms as well. In other words, episode 18 commodifies Sorato and Kosei themselves, dealing with the way that the Medio Kaiju have been subjugated in the capitalist system to be real-life toys or in-universe accessories. Consider the ultimate reveal of the show, that Omega is one of the space gazers, creatures of light that each document a planet's affairs without addressing the exploitation and oppression. So the Medio Kaiju, these symbols of working-class power, are subject to the whims of the gazers, who will either send them out to test new beings or else keep them still and contained. This episode is less a case where I think the show includes Marxist themes than it is one where a Marxist would have a lot of fun interrogating the implications of the questions it brings up. Still, let's tug a little bit deeper. The episode is set away from society. Sorato and Kosei do not want to be observed while they train, nor do they want to accidentally destroy a town. On the part of the showrunners, this means less time spent on practical miniatures, employing less extras, and in theory less money on the entire process. The replacement is the presumably costly CGI portraying the Medio Kaiju in small form that does not look all that great compared to earlier CGI in the show. Diminishing returns in a capitalist framework, perhaps. The effort to build miniatures and then not use them, to make physical suits for the vague sex and props for the media kaiju, but then replace them with CGI, could resemble the planned obsolescence that plagues the tools of labor in a capitalist society. By personifying the tools Omega uses as armor into their own characters and further reducing Kosei to their stature, it criticizes the oppression of the proletariat that a Marxist would believe drives every aspect of the superstructure. Zoggon's failures in the episode come from his misunderstanding of the technology he uses. Because he stole them, he has Zareb's translator and Dada's microdata device. Alienation from the tools of his labor are part of his undoing, and this adventure helped prevent Kosei from succumbing to the same fate with the media kaiju. The constant oppression of lower classes is a very popular theme in Marxist critique. The kaiju genre has always had an interesting relationship with that idea, tabling the communist secondary antagonist Red and Son of Kong, since he deserves a mention but not a full analysis. The original King Kong cast the most powerful creature of all of Skull Island, the one that dominates creatures of the land, sea, and sky, into the imagery of the slave trade. He is put on a stage in chains. When he tries to run away, he's shot to death, and his protection of a white woman is misconstrued as predatory to justify Anne ending up with a strong white man on board the ship in the most abrupt and obligatory romance in classic Hollywood there is. This extends to films such as Mothra and Gorgo, where the abduction of those creatures represent the imperial pressures that Japan and Britain once wrought on the islands from which these monsters hail. Even Godzilla suffered oppression from the humans before his attack, as the nuclear bomb scarred his body. And after he lashes out, the humans kill him while he's defenseless. Still, most often the kaiju is in the role of the oppressor, and the much smaller humans triumph over their oppressor as a collective. This can be to raise class awareness or to pacify a possible rebellion, and this trope goes all the way back to fables and fairy tales of the brave knight liberating his princess from an evil dragon. And yet, even in those cases, it is often an old wizard or witch king archetype, whatever, that controls the dragon. So slaying the dragon only addresses the symptoms of systemic rot. There must be a better solution that does not perpetuate this oppression and violence. The alien Barasa family shows us an admittedly disorganized oppressor, but one that targets monster and human alike. With the addition of the Genesians, Zovaris and Eldigamera in the story, the shared oppression of monsters and humans in the Time Awakening is a motif in the show, and we'll eventually get to how that show ultimately addresses that in a Marxist manner. Zoggon did not come alone. He came with two members of his family, the alien Barasa family. They come before the reveals of the Genesians and re-emergence of Zovaris and Eldigamera, so it's an earlier stage of this theme. Consequently, the Barasa stage and feel themselves oppressed, even though they are objectively the ones in the wrong. When Ayumu liberates Kosei from the makeshift castle, Gilda, Zoggon's sister who stole Kosei from Zoggon, she calls Ayumu a thief, despite Gilda having stolen Kosei and Ayumu literally acting as the knight Gilda valorized, the knight that rescued the maiden that she watched from light years away from Earth and got there too late to kidnap. Zoggon's mother comes in the last second to resolve the conflict, stating that they all must leave. Zoggon complaining about losing his toys, and Gilda about her humans, once again reiterating that the point of the episode was to commodify Kosei in such a way that he understands the Mido Kaiju on a deeper level. The Barasa mother seemingly advocates for a similar philosophy that Sayuki Uta shares in episode 22, the one that episode 25 is devoted to undoing, the idea that humans must stick with humans for Earth defense. In Sayuki's case, it meant for global security. I don't entirely know what Mother Barasa means. Of the 10,000 Barasa siblings, she at least mothered the two we see in this episode, and she treats Earth's doom as a foregone conclusion, which seems to hint that she knows about the Time of Awakening. And yet Zoggon understands Omega as an Ultraman and not as a space gazer, because it's implied that this is the same family that encountered Ultraman Z in his show. I would argue that because the episode borrows imagery from grim fairy tale scenarios, that the Mother Barasa is reflecting the class sentiments presented in stories like the Hare and the Hedgehog that we covered on this channel, where one of the morals was to marry in your own kind. The charitable interpretation is that some kind of class essentialism, where you will always be better at unifying with people that share your same situation. But fairy tales have kind of a weird relationship with class anyway. The Three Bears did not originally feature young child Goldilocks as a hero, but a dirty lower class woman as the villain of the story. Also, the three bears were just roommates, that's why the middle and big bear don't share a bed in any version of the story. That point got away from me. Whether based on The Hare and the Hedgehog or some other fairy tale, I think I am on the right track with this for the mother's attitude, because she contextualizes her statement between what she assumes to be a romantic relationship between Ayumu and Kosei. Even still, though Ayumu and Kosei are from different walks of life, their advancement from working class to special agents in matching suits is the through line of their partnership in the show. This episode ends when the mother gives our trio a gift, some flour dumplings that strangely Sorato hoards, so the ending theme begins with a scene of Kosei and Ayumu chasing him around the warehouse. You will recall that Sorato was our communist 9 episodes ago, teaching Kosei about sharing. And of course, between those moments, Sorato has thrown himself between people and a laser 3 times, twice against El Gamera and once against Dogon's micronizing in this very episode. Sorato will go on to make even more self-sacrificial gestures after this point, even into the finale, so this stands as an out-of-character moment. I will leave it here, though, for you to consider as the strongest counter-argument to the reading of Sorato as a Marxist. It's an outlier, but I'd be remiss not to mention things that go against this reading. Through Zogon, episode 18 shows the dark aspects inherent to tokusatsu entertainment that we discussed all the way back in the Anthropological Criticism section of episode 9. By contrast, episode 19 exists to resolve those questions and leverage the joy and unity that comes from enjoying the art in a healthy way. Now, whether or not I can convince you that the show actually has Marxist tendencies, Marxist criticism asks the same questions about portrayals of class and labor regardless of what the answer is. A Marxist would look at episode 19 and see how it gives excuses for the most grueling and dangerous entertainment work there still is. The timing is also very suspicious. Last episode featured heavy CGI, animating the toy forms of the Mido Kaiju on Zogon ship, and more importantly, in the real world, Tsuburaya Productions shareholders, Bandai and the gambling company Fields, partnered with AI platforms, bringing Ultraman Blazar, otherwise the least toyetic Ultra in a while, to soulless AI slop videos. The contradiction of using Ultraman Blazar and AI makes sense in a dialectical way. The true art resonated with the people and became profitable. Once his show has ended, the continuing profitability of Ultraman Blazar only serves the toyetic capitalism his storytelling downplayed. In this episode, a kaiju chases the energy of an emotional resonance crystal called the Starlight. The monster is Bagragon, and this crystal, normally a clear blue, turns red in the proximity of negative emotions, especially ones like getting angry at your boss, summoning Bagragon to follow the Starlight. From there, Bagragon inadvertently summons a group of kids that film his fight against Omega, led by the aspiring tokusatsu maker Eiichi. Eiichi gets his hands on the crystal and uses it in his tokusatsu diagrams, but his friends leave him, so it turns red again, and Bagragon comes back. At the end of the episode, Eiichi and our main trio bond by making tokusatsu diagrams, and the Starlight is clear once more. Taking the symbol to its logical conclusion, the theme is that tokusatsu makes people happy, and the oppression of humans by monsters only starts when they get fed up with their jobs and try to rebel. This is decidedly not pro-worker, but this is a Marxist analysis, so it's definitely important to discuss how this is exactly the way that Marxists say that culture reinforces the status quo. In the context of Ultraman Omega, it is still a little bit problematic because the time of awakening, where monsters arise and humans and monsters kill each other until they figure out some other solution, it's very soon. So Bagragon's circumstances are very special and anomalous. There are also aspects to this episode that become important under a Marxist lens, which again should not be surprising because dialectics allows for the shirking of Marxist themes to still include Marxist themes the way it's done. Alright, for one thing, this episode juxtaposes Kosei and Eiichi by equating the tokusatsu dream of Eiichi's with Kosei's abandoned athletics. Because Kosei was not a good enough runner for the Olympics, he caved to societal pressure and wound up a poor worker. Eiichi's eventual mastery of the crystal also comes as a result of the mentorship of our main trio. Also, Eiichi's tokusatsu uses just miniatures, thus a less exploitative version of the work. More importantly, this episode follows up on the last one by showing Kosei seeking to understand the different personalities of Mido Kaiju, that Reikiness is friendly, Trigoron dauntless, and Valginus polite. Because of that understanding, Kosei talks to the Mido Kaiju and understands that Reikiness does not want to fight Bagragon, so Kosei and Sorato ask Valginus for help. Though this episode plays apologetics for tokusatsu, This is one of the most significant Marxist moments in the show, personifying the tools of labor and then asking them for help. I should specify, I found the episode heartwarming, I love tokusatsu, I'm just carrying out a Marxist analysis. Alright, now on to the end of the show. Initially, I had a tangent planned for how Omega could represent the Comintern, drawing a comparison between how Omega shows Japan the right way to deal with the kaiju and elevates Kosei to power, similarly to how the connection to Mikhail Borodin elevated Tsuburaya to CCP leadership. But the more I thought about the Space Gazers, the less it made sense to compare a race of unemotional, non-interventionalist watchers to the Soviet Union of all people. I think the point stands for the general idea of Ultraman, though. The Ultras, whatever planet each one comes from, are often ancient and always know how to deal with most kaiju. They do not act recklessly and work to spread freedom and light throughout the universe, such as what the Comintern believed they were doing. In Lionel Method, Makoto Ryoniji failed to consider that before humanity could become as adept in dealing with the kaiju as a society like the Ultras, they would need a transitory period where someone like Ultraman could advise them and protect them from immediate existential threats. Omega, as a space gazer, attained Ultraman status only after careful research and observation, skipping right to inventing anti-kaiju weaponry, led to the emergence of Edomophila, a world-ending threat. A Marxist might connect that to how Mao Zedong, after initial investment in agriculture that balanced their budget and economy, tried to rush China past the capitalist and socialist phases described by Marx straight into communist industrialization, and consequently starved everybody. But again, I scrapped that section for a reason. Okay, so what lens do I use to analyze the rest of the show with Marxism? Omega is even more of a revolutionary figure than he was when I started this whole essay, given that he directly rebels against a flawed system that keeps the Gazers in power while infinite people and kaiju oppress each other, but that will only go so far. And the idea of a researcher/observer turned ultra hero whose inner self tries to convince him to stop him, as Omega does, already exists in Ultra 7, which has more episodes to draw from than Omega does. Kosei is a poor worker who gains the power of Ultraman due to this revolution eventually, and we'll talk about that, but we need a reason for that to be significant. Because here's the thing, until we go deeper than that, it is equally possible that the show is advocating for the workers everywhere to rise up, or that the show is placating Kosei and thus the workers watching in order to quell the revolution. A Marxist can make anything into a reference to Marx. I'm not even a Marxist, and I somehow tie Tsuburaya and Mao Zedong into Ultraman Omega. What will really justify the existence of this essay, and conclusively ring out throughout the Ultraman Omega discourse, is if I can convince you that the show is an example of socialist realism. If you have not done much research into socialist realism, you will probably conflate it with social realism. And if you've done research into either one, you definitely will conflate them. Because it's a much better term, social realism, than socialist realism. I don't know. Social realism merely emphasizes class disparity and working class characters as an artistic style and actual subdivision of realism in art. Audience sympathy is a necessary prerequisite in this case, but it doesn't go much deeper than that. Social realism draws attention to the lower class. But a painting such as American Gothic does not advocate for a socialist revolution, nor does it even imply that the Great Depression farmers portrayed in there will not make it in the struggling capitalist system. Socialist realism, as the Soviet state-mandated strain of social realism, is what everyone describes social realism as. Because it's more easier to define that, just easier and more formulaic to define it that way. And I can do that as such. The workers are cool but struggling. Stalin or Mao is here to liberate them, and they will have an uprising. Look at how well their army hats fit and how straight their arms can be. Oh, look at that. These peasants with no formal education are actually really, really suited to running hospitals and the government. Rinse and repeat. Alright, that was a bit unfair of me to summarize it that way, but look at how far we are in the video. I think I've earned that. Also, I'm Hungarian. When I go to Memento Park, I do this. Anyway, Ultraman Omega is one of my favorite shows. I promise to any Stalinist in the audience, some of that respect will transfer onto socialist realism for the rest of the video. The main things I think we have to look for is if the show valorizes the workers, if it advocates for advancing themes of revolution, and if the work can be considered didactic, where art influences reality and vice versa. Some people would probably say that black and white morality, cloying optimism, and specific creative formalism would be necessary for something to count socialist realism, and I only kind of agree with that. The thing to keep in mind here is that the context of the art's creation is irreconcilably different from that of socialist realism in general. For one thing, socialist realism sets out to be such. You can't accidentally do a socialist realism. And also, as I have mentioned in the video, we are so far divorced from the kind of insulated context where true socialist realism would thrive. That said, art forms have branched off from socialist realism, and debates, however ill-advised, persist as to whether or not Chinese cynical realism, political pop, and hallucinatory realism still count as socialist realism if they still use the same concepts and vernacular as socialist realism just for satirical purposes. So in the line that I'm drawing here, no modern-day socialist realism would be state-mandated by the Soviet Union. That's impossible. But if it touched on the same themes, in the same ways, or even with some of the same language, it can fit. On the surface level, we were a bit of a crossroads with my criteria. Researcher Ayumu was very low on the totem pole, but her connection to revolutionaries Sorato and Kosei propelled her to the forefront of humanity's early efforts against the kaiju. Episode 9 valorizes the importance of the work Kananari hires her to do, not the job itself, and has her only do so to further Sorato's communist lesson to Kosei in the episode. Later on, when the KSCT was formed, despite being a junior partner to Sayuki Uta, Ayumu demonstrates her responsibility, competence, and intellect, coming up with valid solutions to each kaiju problem and outshining Ryoniji, the representative of the petty bourgeoisie that has infiltrated the KSCT, thus necessitating the later creation of the KSSIT, which is the organization we see in the final episode. There's kind of a stretch there of calling Ryoniji the petty bourgeoisie, but it is people like him that don't actually do the work and just thrive off of the work of our main characters. That seems to be the major difference between the two organizations, so I'll count it. All that said, her solution against Omera in the final episode does not work, because Sorato and Kosei have to win. We'll get to them, but let's look in other places first. I've kind of danced around Nariaki Akaji. I might be one of the only people who watched his episodes and included them in my cover to the show. For one thing, I thought I had to at first. But also, I've grown to like the character. Nariaki Akaji, as the protagonist of the special recap episodes that aren't numbered, is a viewpoint character aspiring to be the same kind of invulnerable strongman as Omega. He lives in the same warehouse as Kosei, and his job suffers over the course of his episodes due to the kaiju problem. He remains steadfast in Omega and influences the community to embrace him through calling into a radio cast, even as he gets more and more uncomfortable in status quo. Eventually, he calls the workers to action, though not against their jobs. He is a positive character, but ultimately powerless, and the lesson he learns is to trust in Omega, which seems like pacifying the proletariat, but Nariaki actually demonstrates the desired effect of socialist realism. Socialist realism valorizes certain ideal workers and leaders, and demonstrates their strength in poses on art. Nariaki models the poses of Omega and Sorato in the mirror the way that I am sure many young children did for Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. A character like Nariaki realistically pops up in an Ultra series show out of necessity, as a simple-minded character for the recap episode that kids may find relatable for modeling the same fight scenes they do. But under the lens of socialist realism, he is essentially consuming the propaganda and perpetuating it. And that's really interesting to me. This is all interesting, but there is something even more significant about how the finale of the show that retroactively clarifies what the show's about and building towards. I have held off on this particular spoiler for the ending, at least spelling it out in this article, but it is the missing piece that makes me able to argue this as a socialist realist work of fiction. Okay, so last few episodes, Sorato regains his memories, and his old space gazer personality also rises up just in time for the strongest monster in the Time of Awakening, Zomera, as it's called, to arrive. And it contains the DNA from mid-season villain Elda Gamera and other two-parter villain Zovaris. So it preys on both human and monster alike, as has the capacity to destroy all of humanity, and wants to consume every monster on Earth to do so. Omega leaves the Medio Kaiju, leaving the KSCT and NDF to try and figure out their own solution. And as I mentioned, Ayumu's idea, well, very good, fails. Kosei appeals to the Sorato within Omega, and Ultraman Omega actually starts to fight Somera, as Kosei tries to salvage Ayumu's plan, which involves a Cayenne 102 laser fired at an organ that converts Cayenne 102 on Somera because he absorbed a different monster. It's not really important. This plan fails, actually. Somera kills both Sorato and Kosei. In some kind of spirit realm flashback, life flashing before your eyes, Sorato explains to Kosei, there is one thing they can do. They can merge together. Yes, me, man, you're literally sharing a body now, but the entire show is building towards the Ultraman merging of heavenly spirit with earthly being, and that usually happens at the start of the show. Again, there's two types of Ultra heroes. There's the alien in a human form, or alien that merged with fallen human as repayment for taking its life accidentally. Monsters such as Gamora also fought against Somera in the two-parter, but the Medio Kaiju are about to, because this newly invigorated Ultraman can use all three Medio Kaiju at once. So Sorato says that this is humans, aliens, and Kaiju working together. With the Time of Awakening climaxing with Somera, our communist heroes have literally merged and now work with the new international Kaiju force that seeks coexistence with the Kaiju, which has been the text's preferred outcome ever since Sorato compared Grime as a species to humans. And even sooner than that, with his attitude on the Kaiju of Earth being different than you'd expect an Ultra to have. In this little postscript to the battle, like I said, a month after, Omega's reputation has been salvaged, and he has even convinced the general public to coexist with the Kaiju. Sayoki Uta is taking steps to communicate with the Space Gazers to tell them about this radical new path. The end of Sorato's phrase that I mentioned is that what these groups are working together for is a new Earth, a utopia that seems abrupt, but has its foreshadowing throughout the previous 24 episodes. Here's a quote from a 1934 gathering of Soviet writers about what socialist realism entails. Socialist realism is the basic method of Soviet literature and literary criticism. It demands of the artist that he be the truthful, historically concrete representation of reality in its revolutionary development. Moreover, the truthfulness and historical concreteness of the artistic representation of reality must be linked with the task of ideological transformation and education of workers in the spirit of socialism. Close quote. We have covered much of the revolutionary development in the show and how Sorato educated Kosei in the spirit of socialism, but there is one more thing this show has that is important. The core of socialist realism is visualizing reality not as it is, but as it should be in the revolution. This show already laid out the terms for what ought to be when developing the stakes. Kosei and Sorato should fight together. Humanity should not be oppressed by monsters. Humanity should not oppress monsters. Unity is the goal. Kosei, Ayumu, Sayoki, and Sorato should use their gifts to help people and Kaiju. There's an episode where the Kaiju of the Week is helped by our team. Episode 20, it's a time-traveling Triceratops. Anyway, after a show progressing these themes, in the final moments of the final episode, we get a utopia where our heroes have progressed to the top of the world response on Kaiju. And as Sorato says, Kaiju, humans, and aliens are all working together for this new Earth. It is a utopia that we as the audience are not allowed to challenge. And this is the profound part. It's a utopia only achievable through the deaths of Kosei and Sorato. Because that's how they merged together for it to happen. The same way that the Great Leap Forward failed. But the socialist realist art acted as if it worked. This utopia is impossible. And it is cope for a massive failure. But it does not matter anyway. It is a story. And if we act like these larger-than-life heroes, Sorato and Kosei, it will work for us. Even though it didn't work for them. That's the way you can read this as a socialist realist finale. And that is fascinating. Well, okay, this has gone on a long time. We weaved in and out of a lot of concepts here. A lot of it went over my head as well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If not, leave your comments down in the comments and do that either way. I would appreciate the engagement. But yeah, thank you for watching. We have a Plan 9 Crunch YouTube page here that you're watching this on, hopefully. We also have a TikTok page sometimes. I don't know if it gets whatever. We have a conventional blog, Plan 9 Crunch, where you can plan9crunch.com, where you can see the original version of this that covered just episode 9. And our Facebook page, Plan 9 Crunch Podcast and Blog, will host things from both sources, so look into those as you will. Thank you all for watching, and that's a wrap.